It will be a summary that we made in 2020 when during the Baltic Museology School we have such an event when 30 museum specialists gathering together to learn and to speak about different issues of the museum field. And the topic of the 2020 of the Baltic Museology School was preparedness for the emergency situations in museums. So we I have made some overview of how what kind of a legislation system we have in Lithuania, which is connected with preparedness to protect cultural heritage in time or in the event of armed conflict. First of all, the beginning and the main document is in 2006, it was approved by the Parliament of Republic of Lithuania, the program for the protection of cultural heritage in the event of armed conflict. And the aim of this project was to preserve the country's cultural heritage of national significance. But for sure, all the programs, we have some period and deadline. So the deadline of this program is 2010, but the other documents which were like a part of this program, like included in the measures plan program, it is still valid. They are legal and they should be followed by the organizations. And all these measures are financed by the budget allocations and responsibility, all the institutions participating in it. We have to provide the annual reports to the Ministry of Culture, and we, in our way, provide the report to the government of Republic of Lithuania. Later on, at the same time, in the same year, actually, by the government of Republic of Lithuania, a measure plan was confirmed. It consists of 10 measures that should be implemented via horizontally, but there are so many texts to read, so I just marked the keywords. It's about the lists of immovable cultural heritage and movable cultural values of exceptional cultural value that we have to make. Prepare the rules for marking these objects, including unmovable and immovable heritage, then to prepare an instruction for armed forces, because they also participate in this program. Prepare instructions for the protection and evacuation of movable cultural property in museums, precisely in the memory institutions, museums, libraries, archives, and also in cult buildings, to install special premises for the storage and protecting, to mark the objects, and to obtain supplement new and updated topograph map databases, which is the responsibility of the Minister of Defense and the armed forces, to organize trainings, of course, and to prepare routes for transit for these culture values. So very short information about that. It is done already, and as I have mentioned, it is valid and is obligatory for the organizations to follow and to use. In 2007, fulfilling the measure number 1 about the lists of immovable cultural heritage by the resolution of the government, 3 lists were approved. It is like institutional memory doesn't last so long that we don't know why exactly 19 or 38 sites were included in 2007. So we have challenges now. It means that we have to decide, like a homework in Lithuania. How many lists do we need? Should it be 1 or 3? How many objects should be in these lists? And what kind of selection criteria should we follow to including the objects into this list? And who should be the final decision maker of making this list? It's the most important questions. Mm-hmm. After making these lists, also we fulfilling the measure number 3, which is connected to prepare the rules of marking of these objects of immovable cultural heritage. By the Minister of Culture order, it was rules approved how these objects should be marked. They are renewed, as far as I remember, probably last year, this order. Because it's closely connected with the status of immovable cultural heritage, how many sites on which place, and all the objects that are in the immovable cultural heritage objects list of exceptional cultural value, we are marked with these. It's not very much, but we are. Later, it is not connected with the Ministry of Culture, but we have the order of the Minister of National Defense. We approved the instruction of participation of the armed forces in case of armed conflict, which is connected with the preservation of immovable cultural heritage objects. And the fourth point says that in the event of emergency situation, those heritage objects that are included in the list of immovable cultural heritage objects of exclusive cultural value, which are confirmed and are marked with one of the 3 conventions distinguished marks, shall be rescued. So, if the object is not in the list, it's not the responsibility and any obligations for armed forces. Also, we have the most important, actually, order of the Minister of Culture. We call it number 500. And people who are working with this, in this field of the protection of the cultural heritage, they usually know what we are speaking about, order number 500. It's an instruction for the protection and evacuation of movable cultural property in museums, libraries, archives, and cult buildings. And it's also the obligation to the memory institutions to compile the list of movable cultural values of exceptional ethnic, historical, aesthetic, or scientific value in museums, and also other obligations, which are quite a lot, but in some kind they are quite difficult because you have to think in advance and to plan something that it is just foreseen or predictable, but very important things. First of all, to draw up the plan for the evacuation of cultural property, to designate persons. It means that people have to know who is responsible and for what. To determine which cultural property should be evacuated first. It means that we all know that in museums, libraries, and archives, everything is very valuable. But in this case, we ask the directors of these institutions to choose. And this is the most difficult thing, to choose between all the children. That is the most loved and most valuable, but it is necessary because we have to be quite realistic that to evacuate and to save everything, it could be impossible. So we have to think first of all about the priorities. After setting the priorities, the priority list of the culture values, we ask directors to draw up the plans for the premises, to provide schemes for evacuation, also to have backup. It means plan B if plan A doesn't work. Acquire the packaging material and to estimate and to calculate the cost of time, not only the money, but also the time and means and other resources. It means transport and other, etc. And to provide ways to preserve the accounting documents also, because not only cultural values should be evacuated and saved, but also all the necessary documentation, and to organize trainings for the staff. In museum, library, or archive. Taking in consideration that it's quite difficult, and also everything starts from the beginning, and we know that the armed conflict is one of the emergency situations, and we know that, everybody knows, and in Lithuania, these entities who must ensure the protection of the most important cultural heritage objects and movable cultural values, we have to have prepared the emergency management plans. And it is obligation set by another ministries and ministers and institutions. And we have noticed after several years looking to these emergency situation management plans, that the most difficult thing in these plans is to set and identify the threatening events, emergency situations, and to list them in order of priority. And so we have noticed very forms and kinds of emergency situation plans with all the imagination that is possible. Most of emergency management plans I suppose till this year were accepted and seen as document like formal, that is necessary to have, but thinking about that it will not happen to us at all. The basic threatening events listed in these plans are fire, flood, storm, sometimes earthquakes in Lithuania, and sometimes ignoring the priorities, like we always have priority of human beings and lives, and then only property, environment, and just leading and this is, leads to how we say the conflict of thinking, because in museums people, they think that we have just by the way save all the culture values escaping. So taking in consideration this, we in 2020 prepared the recommendations it is confirmed by the order of the Minister of Culture. The recommendations for the preparation of emergency management plans for the culture institutions and owners of the immovable cultural heritage objects in order to assist them while they preparing the emergency management plans, how to properly assess the threats and prepare for the prevention or eliminating consequences. These recommendations, I suppose for you professors, nothing new. We use international practice and documents, and it's very useful for everybody and all institutions just to look through of them. These recommendations of UNESCO Convention concerning the protection of the world culture and natural heritage and other documents, and we have set and just made a very clear structure of the possible threats that we have to think about. It's first of all natural phenomena, that it's not only flood, not only storm, but it's a sample that we had. Landslides, it's our main symbol, the Tower of Gediminas Hill, and it is slopes, it's landslides, it's also emergency situation for the culture object. And all these sometimes probably seen as impossible threats, they have to be taken into mind and think about if it or could it happen, and is it very, very possible or not. Then we had events caused by the human error, activities or omission, or not This is a sample from 2017, when during the music festival Granatos Live, many of you probably know, we had a huge fire in Lithuanian Open Air Museum and all homestead was burned down. So it's also not, it's also collapse of buildings could be, it could be explosions or something that is sometimes working in memory institutions you even don't think about. But it could be, and sometimes practice shows. And the last part is intentionally man-made events, like bombs, explosive threats, public unrest, gatherings, riots, thefts, some cyber attacks that we spoke during the lunch. It's about also that it seems probably for many of people that it's not very common and has nothing common with the museum work, but it is. And here is the sample of the biggest amber piece. So we call it sunstone, Saulės akmuo, and it was stolen in 2002. It was a theft. Also, this is a sign next to it, a photo of a sign of the Kaunas 9/4 Museum. It's connected with the Holocaust and other sensitive and difficult heritage here in Lithuania. So some activities, vandalism can also be. And very short, at the end of my presentation, just short, very overview. In these recommendations, we also, to each possible threat, we made the list that should be done by evaluating that all possible events should be assessed and described. Then main protection and security objectives are set. To prevent physically and organizational measures should be taken in consideration. to have a clear plan and system information, how you inform people, how you inform your staff, how you inform outside, for example, visitors that you are responsible for too. And the main recommendations consist of 9 points. It's also, I just like to stress only the keywords. It means that the necessity to carry out, like we call audit of cultural institution, in order to identify possible threats, to find out what extent or value or losses could be, to assess all available and provide all the necessary resources, to plan the necessary preventive or remedial measures at the different level of management, and carry out annual assessment. It's very important, because it doesn't mean that you made the emergency management plan and you left forever and it doesn't change. So each year you have just reassess it, or add and or some exclude something that is not important anymore. Very important to cooperate with a representative of special services. It's very important. Not only made these emergency management plans with your, like, you know better and nobody else can work with it, just to consult with special services, to ensure the constant dissemination of information to employees. It doesn't mean that you have to publish this emergency management plan on Facebook or somewhere else, but just to get to know that all your staff knows what to do in exact emergency situation, ensure the protection and security, and to constantly monitor emergencies, incidents in the country or abroad, to get the experience, to get knowledge. And this, at this point I will end, because the experiences and knowledges will be, it's opportunity for us to get them from Professor Peteriu Stone. And you will have a possibility to listen to key presentations. I suppose I will read the very long title.
I would just say responsibility.
Responsibilities. So I will not read the long title. It will be Responsibilities of a Blue Shield International and the work of a Blue Shield International movement. Mm-hmm. So thank you for listening. For me, I suppose it was quite short, not very short, but quite short summary and overview of situation in Lithuania. But I suppose that more interesting and for sure more interesting and practical information will be given by Professor Peteriu Stone. And I will give the floor to you for your next presentations.
Thank you. No, I don't think I need that. Responsibilities, yeah. Okay. Are we ready? Yep. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to come to Lithuania. And thank you also for letting me speak in English. I have to say that wherever I go, because I can only speak in English, but thank you anyway for letting me do that. And also my apologies for possibly the longest ever title of a presentation, which is on the screen behind me. When I was asked to do this, I was asked, I think, by Estonia to say what I was going to cover, and so hence this title came out. But really I'm talking about the obligations, the responsibilities, and the opportunities about ratifying and critically implementing the 1954 Hague Convention and its protocols, but also some of the other international instruments that I'll talk about. So, a little bit of contemporary context. No one was prepared for a war of this magnitude, so it was improvised. In other words, nobody was prepared, nobody had done the preparation, nobody had done the critical thing that was necessary and is necessary in terms of cultural property protection to prepare in peacetime. And that's, if I get one message across, that's the message across that I would like to get for the rest of the afternoon. If we try to prepare and react to armed conflict, we're too late. And I think we will find in the Ukrainian situation that there has been loss of cultural property, both immovable and movable, that might have been saved had more preparation been done in peacetime. That's not a criticism of Ukraine in the slightest. There is almost no country in the world who has ratified the convention and all the protocols, who has properly implemented them, because nobody gets around to it. It's something that we're never going to have an armed conflict. We're never going to be invaded. It's not therefore going to be high on our priority list. And until countries realize the potential, then we're going to be in this situation. And the situation we're in, the issue, is that cultural property, and I use the term usually cultural property because that's the name of the 54 convention, but read for that the list in brackets on there. But if the 54 convention had been written in 1964, it would undoubtedly have been the Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Heritage in the event of armed conflict. So we are stuck with the legal term cultural property, but understand that as broadly as you wish. And there are usually three responses to whether cultural property how cultural property is damaged and destroyed. Firstly, nothing can be done, it's war. Things get broken and destroyed and damaged. And colleagues of mine, when I started this work in 2003, used to just tell me and pat me on the head, Pete, get real, it's going to be damaged, it's going to be destroyed. There's nothing you can do about it. The second reaction is it's a humanitarian issue. Protecting people is far more important than protecting old things. And from a military perspective, the third reaction is there's no time to protect cultural heritage. Sorry, sir, we're fighting a war. And those are the reactions that we normally get. Hang on, sorry. Are those assertions correct? And I would argue that no, they're not. Cultural heritage can be protected if the process is started early enough, peacetime. But it can't just be left to the heritage sector, who should, of course, perhaps take the lead. But it must be seen as a responsibility of the uniformed sector, in particular in armed conflict, the military, and it must be seen as an integral part of military responsibilities, and we'll come to that in a moment. But I spent my first probably 10 years dealing with this, getting it wrong, because I would tell the military that they had to protect things because they were important for heritage and for culture. And the military would smile at me and say, that's been a really fascinating conversation, we'll be in touch, which meant, please go away, I never want to see you ever again. Because it bore no relationship to their priorities. So what I had to learn, and it took me a long time to realize that I had to learn this, but I had to learn a new language, which was military. So we don't say that things are important because they're important heritage, we say they're important because they may be a force multiplier. We say not that you're going to country A, but you are deploying in theatre. What are the cultural property complications in the battle space? Which element of J1 to J9 is the relevant bit of the military jigsaw puzzle who's going to take responsibility for this? And I could go on and I could lose you all in military acronyms and terminology, but to get the military and the armed forces on side, you have to learn their language and get them to understand. It must also be seen as part of the humanitarian portfolio. The protection of people first, always, but the protection of people and the protection of their cultural heritage are indivisibly intertwined. And I'll look at that again in a moment. And I'll talk more about much of that in the Blue Shield. And as I say, now we're going to concentrate on the responsibilities, obligations, and opportunities. But just before we do that, why is cultural property and cultural property protection important? Well, the heritage provides the tangible and the intangible link to the past that helps individuals and communities provides them with a sense of place, a sense of identity, a sense of belonging. It gives them a sense of dignity. We must always put people first, and the social, mental, and economic stability of populations first, but that equally means looking after their cultural heritage, because if we don't, much of that well-being is actually based around the historic environment. And we can talk about that later if you want to. And so it needs to be a key element of the thinking of both the armed forces, the uniformed sector, and the humanitarian and heritage sectors. And we'll talk about this under the Blue Shield, but all of those sectors, uniformed, humanitarian, heritage, start in completely different places, but they all have, in Blue Shield language, the aspiration of creating healthy, peaceful, stable, sustainable communities. Because once we've got that, then the humanitarians and the uniformed sectors can, or at least the armed forces, can go home, and the heritage people can get on with what heritage people do. And that's the situation that we want to get to. People constantly question my view that the protection of people and the protection of their heritage are indivisibly intertwined. And I apologize for this next slide, but I just want to underline why I see that as absolutely fundamental to what we're talking about. So in the, okay, we seem to have frozen.
Sorry.
No? Okay, I will describe this and hopefully we can get the next slide up in a moment. In the former Yugoslavia, the population of a village was rounded up and machine gunned into a trench that had been freshly dug to take their bodies. At the same time, the trench wasn't filled in with the earth that had been taken out to create the trench, but was filled in with the rubble of that village's mosque. And the village's mosque had not only been knocked down, but had been taken down to what I, as an archaeologist, would say natural. So there was no chance of an archaeologist coming along in 5 days, 5 years, or 500 years and saying that there was the ground print of a mosque in that village. Totally eradicated, and it was then buried with its population. And if you can't get closer as an intertwined, indivisible thing of being buried together, I don't know how close you can get. This doesn't seem to be working at all. Here we go, I can do it down here. So there's the horrible image. As a result of that thinking, Yves Dacour, the then Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, started making statements like this: protecting cultural property and cultural heritage against the devastating effects of war, unfortunately, remains a humanitarian imperative today, perhaps more than ever. But of course, cultural property protection comes with a health warning, because it defines who people are and, of course, who they are not, who belongs and who does not, who is included and who is excluded. Cultural property can be and has frequently been used as an excuse for conflict and as a target in conflict. The former fighting in the Yugoslavia, ISIS attacks on the Yazidi, and in some instances, perhaps the current conflict in Ukraine. but it can be, and I would argue it should be, and this is why we're here, used as a vehicle for understanding, mutual recognition, and peace building. So I'm going to gallop through some of the legal requirements for cultural property protection and some of this international context. And I'm starting effectively in 1954, but the little bit in brackets above that is to show that there is a longer tailback there, and that tailback actually goes back to 2,500 years ago. And in 6th century BC China, Sun Shao, who wrote the famous Art of War, argued that to allow cultural property to be damaged by your forces was a major military mistake, because what you were doing was creating the first reason for the next conflict. And so military thinking has been for about 2,500 years that allowing cultural property to be damaged, or worse, damaging it yourself during a conflict, is really bad military practice. And that moves all the way through the system. The earliest iteration I've found in terms of specific legislation for an army going to conflict is 1385, and the so-called Durham Ordinances, which were the rules of war that the English army, which was yet again invading Scotland, was going to abide by in that conflict. And one of the articles in the Durham Ordinances was that any soldier found damaging or destroying a religious building, at that stage the equivalent of any cultural building, would be dealt with harshly. And the penalty for that was the same as the penalty for rape: execution. So way back in 1385. Bringing it right up to date, we have just about up to date, we have the 54 Hague Convention. I'm not going to go through all of this, many of you will know it all, but I just want to pick out some, as we did before, of the key wording in these documents. So in the definition of what cultural property is, it's immovable or movable heritage of great importance to the cultural heritage of every people. That's what's protected under the 54 Convention. And there's the list under paragraph A there of what that means. It's also the buildings in which that movable material is housed: the libraries, the archives, the museums. And then finally, it can be, for immovable cultural property, what they call centres containing a large number of objects. And any of the three historic centres of the three capitals I've been in over the last 3 days would fit as centres containing monuments: Old Riga, Old Tallinn, Old Vilnius. The second article of the 54 Convention talks about protecting cultural heritage, and it defines two sides to protection. And the two key words of the 54 Convention are safeguarding and respect. And taking that a little further in terms of safeguarding, in the 54 Convention, it doesn't actually define it. And this is one of the frustrations of the 54 Convention, that it was written by people who had just been through at least one, and many of them 2, world wars. So they knew exactly what they meant by guard stuff. Didn't feel the need to write it down. So it only became written down in a little bit more detail when we get to the 1999 Second Protocol, which I'll come to in a moment. But so you need to safeguard stuff by taking any measures that you feel appropriate, which isn't overly helpful. Hang on. No, sorry, I jumped ahead in the slides. So I've still jumped ahead. So, yeah, Article 4 is then respect for cultural property. And it's respect for cultural property in your territory and in the territory of any enemy you may have. And it's also related to looting of cultural property. But you'll notice that that's paragraph 1 and paragraph 3 of Article 4, because paragraph 2 is the great military get-out clause, which is military necessity. And the military can make a claim that they can destroy cultural property if there is military necessity to do so. Now, the example I always use for that, if you think of a city divided by a river and there are 3 bridges over the river, one of which is a historic bridge and 2 of which are modern. So long as the 2 modern bridges are there, the Hague Convention precludes the military use of the historic bridge. However, if the 2 modern bridges have been destroyed, then military necessity dictates that if it is military necessity to get over the river, they are allowed to use the historic bridge. So it's that sort of situation that military necessity, again, unhelpfully not defined in the 54 Convention, but that's the sort of thing that they're talking about. Then we go to Article 7, and the key part of that is military measures. And is there anybody from the Ministry of Defence in the room? No. Okay, all right. They're online. Yeah, okay. For those of you online, I hope you're there. These are the things that the military is obliged to do in peacetime to prepare the armed forces of any country who have ratified the convention to be ready for proper cultural property protection. Firstly, everybody in uniform needs to be educated about the value and the importance of cultural property. And secondly, there should be a unit, or what the military call a capability, within every armed force of every country who have ratified, that there is a special understanding about cultural property protection in that capability. Now, many European countries equate that with the creation of a small unit. So the Austrians, the Dutch, the British have these small units. The Americans, for example, have not defined a small unit, but all of they are anticipating that a large number of their civil affairs officers will get an understanding of cultural property protection. So it's a different way of looking at it. The other thing that the Hague Convention does is identify a more important level of protection. So you have the generic level of great importance to all people. You then have what is identified as going to be a limited number of places of very great importance. Okay, so special protection of very great importance, and I'll come to that in a moment as we develop. So those are the cherry picks from the 54 Convention that create the environment that everybody is supposed to work within. We then get to the second protocol. And in the second protocol, they begin to define what it means by precautionary measures, by all those appropriate means from the 54 Convention. So it's the preparation of inventories, planning of emergency measures, preparation of removal of material if need be, and the designation of competent authorities. Now, it was great to see all of the stuff that we saw before, the sort of policy level of what Lithuania does. I'm not going to ask at the moment how much of that is actually turned into practice by every museum and every archive in the country. But I can say without hesitation that almost no country that has ratified the convention and both protocols has put that list of 4 requirements into practice completely. None of them have done the last one at all. And so we are stuck with that as an issue. And then we have the precautions against all types and effects of hostilities. So, and again, this is just very simple stuff, but it underlines what the second protocol is all about. You're supposed to be removing cultural property from the vicinity of military objectives, or provide for in situ protection, and you're supposed to be avoiding locating military objectives near to cultural sites. You can't do that during a conflict. All of that has to be done before the conflict. And if you try and do it during the conflict, you're too late. Then we bring in a third level in the second protocol of protection. So we've got general protection, special protection, and now enhanced protection of the greatest importance for humanity. It's supposed to be an even shorter list. And at the moment, there are 17 sites only in the world under enhanced protection, and Lithuania has one of them. And, but that's where we're at. And one would argue that the full ratification has not been pushed forward by any country because we've got general protection, a very few, 20-odd plus sites under special protection and 17 under enhanced protection. Then, even though they are supposed to be very special, I would have thought there should be more very special sites in other parts of the world. And then, so this is just my list of the key things that we should be doing under the Hague Convention before the conflict. I'm not going to read it all. You can see it there. It's reiterating what we've been through. But again, I would argue that there is almost certainly no country on the planet who has put all of that into practice, which is why we constantly find cultural property is damaged and destroyed beyond the level that it need in conflicts because we haven't prepared properly. So that's the 54 Convention. I want to just dip into some of the other elements of possibility of the international support network. So the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court, and the state parties to the statutes in the preamble, conscious that all peoples are united by common bounds, their cultures pieced together in a shared heritage, and concern that this delicate mosaic may be shattered at any time. So quite nice poetic language in the preamble, but turn that into the reality of two of the articles in the Rome Statute, and the following can be deemed to be war crimes and therefore can be under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, who can, under these articles, prosecute individuals for war crimes. So the intentionally directing attacks against buildings and the pillaging or looting of material. And to show that the ICC has slightly more teeth than the 54 Convention is that Mr. Al-Faqi al-Mahdi was now 3 or 4 years ago prosecuted and convicted for the destruction of 9 mausolea and 1 mosque in Timbuktu in Mali, and Mr. al-Mahdi was the head of the religious compliance unit of Ansandine. And one of the ways that he was prosecuted, part of the evidence that was put by the prosecution were the videos that had been made of Mr. al-Mahdi standing in front of the mausoleum behind him saying, "These are un-Islamic, we must not allow these to be to continue in existence, and so I'm just about to instruct my men to destroy it." And the reason they made those videos was because of the media impact and the social media impact of gaining more recruits for Ansandine. they hadn't worked out that it could also be used in terms of evidence against an individual if that individual was brought up under the ICC. And Mr. Al-Mahdi, as it says there, was convicted for 9 years, or sentenced, sorry, for 9 years. But the interesting point in the final statement from the court is the paragraph there. So the targeted buildings, the Mausolea and the mosque, were not only religious buildings. They also had a symbolic and emotional value for the inhabitants of Timbuktu. They constitute a common heritage for that community. And that's where we go back to the creation of a sense of place, a sense of identity, a sense of belonging. And that's essentially what the ICC court was prosecuting Al-Mahdi for, rather than just the destruction of some buildings. We then have the UN Security Council resolutions that come out, most of which, and there are probably 8 or 9 of these now, relate to the trade in illicit cultural property. And that's because the UN Security Council see that trade as a security issue and a threat to peace, because that trade brings in a great deal of funding to perpetuate the conflicts. And if you hear, and you will have all heard, estimates about how valuable that trade is, I would counsel you to take them with a pinch of salt, because nobody knows how much Ansandine or ISIS or anybody else brings in from there. To know that, those organizations would have to fill in tax returns, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. What we do have a good feel for is it is probably in closer to the million or millions of euros than it is to the 5 or 10 euros on an annual basis. I was giving a presentation to a group of senior American officers a few years ago, and at the end of the presentation, after I'd said you have to take all of these estimates with some level of caution, an American general came up to me and said, "Sir, I couldn't care less if it's only $100,000 US, because $100,000 US buys an awful lot," in his words, "of guns and ammunition to kill my boys and girls. And I want that trade stopped tomorrow." And that's where you can get the military on side by giving them the evidence that this trade, which is technically absolutely nothing to do with them, but has a major impact on what they're doing in a fight in trying to win a conflict. So you get, so 2347 is the particular UN Security Council resolution that deals with the protection of cultural property, and you can see it there. And I just picked one other one of this sort of broader context for all of this at the UN international level. And there are similar statements and documents at a European level, but I haven't just gone into those because we haven't got time. But in 2019, the UN came up with a plan of action about safeguarding religious sites. And it had a series of recommendations to the UN, to nation states, to religious organizations and religions. But recommendation 4 out of 6 to the UN was that the UN should continue to develop strategies and tools aimed at strengthening the protection of heritage, including that of religious interest. So there again, the UN are saying, guys, get your act together, work this out, put those strategies and tools in place, because if you don't, this problem is just going to carry on. And that's there. So I want to end this bit of the presentation really with talking about some topic sheets that the Blue Shield is just about to produce. I unfortunately had hoped that I would be able to show you one of these on the screen in draft, but we haven't quite got there. But the idea is that we will produce these, and I'll go through them in a moment, they are, most of them are going to be 2 sides of paper and are simple, mostly questions about, are you ready for these topics? And have you got your plans in place for these topics? Because these are the questions that you need to ask yourself to get the policies changed to the reality of action on the ground. So I'm going to talk about those in a moment. The other thing I'm just going to mention now and pass around, so my apologies to those listening on a virtual connection, they're not going to see these very easily. But what a number of armed forces have done over the last, 15 plus years is produce packs of cards. And on the cards, there are very, very simple cultural property protection messages. And completely unknown to me, why should I know? But one of the things that the military do and soldiers do all the time is, and described, is 99% of a soldier's life is utter boredom, 1% is utter fear. Of the 99%, what do? They play cards a lot. And forces we produce these sorts of cards for a number of militaries around the world, and this particular example is a set of cards that have been produced for the UN peacekeeping deployment in Lebanon. And so all of the examples are Lebanese cultural property, and the simple messages are ones that are used in these sort of cards generically, but are contextualized for UNIFIL troops into the things that they might see when they're out on patrol. So these are the sorts of things, and every soldier deploying to UNIFIL gets a pack of these. And that's the sort of drip effect of cultural property protection that relates to Article 7, Paragraph 1 of education and raising awareness within the armed forces for that. So if I just pass those to you and you pass them around as we go through. So I'll then just talk, if I can find the mouse, which I have just lost. There. So these topic sheets, I'll just go through them very briefly. You can see roughly what's on them on there. So the first one is going to be just a general introduction. The second one is going to be on the legal responsibilities. The third on why should countries prepare in peacetime. I hope I've emphasized that enough. Fourth one, who should protect. And we're going to send round a PDF of this presentation, so you don't have to take images of these if you'll get them later today or tomorrow. Then the next 4, what should be protected? And it's not just tangible heritage in our argument, it should be intangible cultural heritage. It should also be natural heritage, because the West and Europe, and when I say the West, it's really Europe and North America and some of those countries with what are referred to in Australia as settler governments, so essentially European governments in other parts of the world. It's only that group of the world who make the distinction between cultural and natural. No indigenous community makes that distinction. None of the African countries will make that distinction. It's only there. So natural heritage is just as important to the cultures of many populations there. And then how do we prioritize, and in particular in terms of the 54 Convention, whether we go for a special or enhanced? What are the types of threats? And we'll come back to that when I'm talking about the Blue Shield. When should they be done? Where should protection take place? And then finally, how to safeguard CPP, so what level of packing, what are the environmental conditions, those sorts of things. The threats to the illegal trafficking of cultural property, which links to the 1970 convention. A key one, increasingly, and I would suggest that while we're not talking about armed conflict, we're talking about conflict in terms of cyber attack. Just as one, to me, impartially silly but astonishing example of this, the Blue Shield, about a month ago now, changed its host for its website and where all the servers were and everything. And we got a new company in to do the security on the website. And in the second week of the new website being up, the people in charge of the security of the website got in contact and said, we thought you might like to see this statistic. And so I looked at the email and I thought they just got it completely wrong. I thought they'd put the comma in the wrong place in the figure. Because in the previous 7 days, the Blue Shield website had attempted not once, not 10, not 100, but 320,000 times in 7 days. They think, the security company think, that all of those came from China, but they can't guarantee that because hackers frequently use what apparently they call mirror sites to hide their actual place of where they are. Let's assume, for example, that at least half of those actually came from China. We had no idea whether they came from the Chinese government or a bunch of kids playing around trying to hack into any site that they got to on the internet. But 320,000 times. If you then put that into the context of a real potential conflict between two states, one of the obvious targets is the cultural heritage sector. And it's an obvious target because it's usually at least part of government, or at least parts of it are parts of government, and governments are an obvious target. But equally, it's something that if you change surreptitiously with information on that site, become immediately identified as a change to the site, then you can actually begin to rewrite history. So as a silly example, if somebody hacked into the Department of Culture, Media and Sport in Britain and they changed all of the words English to Scottish and vice versa, they could change the course of British history. And that's, as I say, a silly example, but think of it slightly more or closer to home, and how some countries might want to change the history of another country. And there are issues, and I would hope, serious concerns there. And just as another example of that, universities in the UK were specifically targeted by hackers about 18 months ago now. And some of my colleagues lost email access for 6 months because the system was so badly broken by the hackers that nobody managed to set up. Now, they set up other systems for getting them access, but they couldn't get to their historic emails or anything because of that hack. Just think of the confusion into a country, into ministries, into museums, all of that access, the personnel data, the financial data, all of the chaos that could be done. Do any museums, libraries or archives or even ministries have the proper defences in place? Certainly in terms of individual museums and the such, I would question. And so we need to really think about those as an issue. And the person who's writing that particular one for us does quite a lot now. He's quite busy with universities who have learnt their lesson of not being protected, and he's trying to work with universities on that. But he also does the cybersecurity for the National Health Service. Because again, all of the personal records that could, cause chaos if they were put public are very under threat. And then finally, the idea of the value of creating a Blue Shield national community. So that's been very quick. I hope it's been useful. I hope it's put a few thoughts in your minds. I hope I haven't depressed you too much, but thank you for listening.
Thank you. And this was the first presentation, as I'm correct. So we will switch on now to the next presentation. I just remind people who are watching us online not to forget the questions probably, and later we will check the chat if there are any of them. So now Professor will proceed with the second presentation, the work of the Blue Shield movement.
Okay, so thank you. Me again, my apologies, but talking about the Blue Shield movement. Okay, and I'm going to start this and just see if, we're back that working. So I want to start this in the late 1940s, early 1950s. So the international community at the end of the Second World War, as I say, many of whom had lived through 2 world wars, had a very clear understanding, as I hope I'll sort of explain in the next couple of minutes, about the importance of cultural heritage to stopping anything like the Second World War or the First World War happening again. So the first step of that was in 1945 with the creation of UNESCO and the well-known first words of the UNESCO Constitution that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defences of peace must be constructed. My wife tells me that that's the only bit of antiquated language that she thinks is still correct, because if women had been in charge, there wouldn't have been any conflicts, but let's leave that one aside. But a few lines further down in the Constitution, there's an explicit acceptance that political and economic processes are not enough. For peace to be established, it has to be on the basis of humanity's moral and intellectual solidarity. And UNESCO are going to deliver that as part of the UN process through education, science, and culture. That's why UNESCO's there. It's not there to put more sites on the World Heritage List. It's there to create a global environment of peace. Sometimes I think UNESCO may have forgotten that, but that's what it's there for. Then, of course, you have the mainly 1946 trials of senior Nazis in Nuremberg. And a number of those prosecutions included prosecutions for damage to cultural property, or in fact, most of them for the looting of cultural property. Now, most of those prosecutions also included more horrible crimes, but it's instructive that the international community at the time thought it important enough to add those crimes against cultural property. 1948, the Genocide Convention. Raphael Lemkin, who drafted the Genocide Convention and created the term genocide, in the original draft had 2 forms of genocide: barbarism, genocide against people, and then cultural genocide, which is today often referred to as ethnocide. But that cultural genocide was the destruction of people's cultural property. And again, going back to my comments earlier about the indivisibility of the protection of people and the protection of their cultural property. Lemkin got it and he put it into the first drafts. Cultural genocide was taken out at the last minute in the 48 conference that decided the text of the convention at the insistence of a number of colonial powers and, as I say, as defined in Australia, settler governments, because of the potential ramifications for how they were dealing with indigenous communities at the time. So it was there, but then taken out, but it's an indication. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 again, everybody has the right to participate in the cultural life of the community and the arts and etc. So it's there in all of these statements, and there are others that I could have listed, because the community at the end of 2 world wars saw the importance of the protection of cultural property, both tangible and intangible. And then comes the now primary piece of international legislation about the protection of cultural property, the 54 Convention. And it's very clear that in amongst those who were at the conference that decided the final text of the 54 Convention, that they anticipated the creation of something that they talked about and referred to in 1954-55 as the blue and white shield. And they called it the blue and white shield because on the shield there is both blue and white. But unfortunately, despite the fact they saw that as being, envisaged that as happening straight away, and that being the, quotes, cultural equivalent of the Red Cross, the ICRC, it didn't happen until 1996. And so a number of years passed without that system being put into place, but intended by those who created the 54 Convention. So the Blue Shield, only 42 years late, was created in 1996, is an international organization established under Dutch law, dedicated to the protection of heritage from conflict and disasters. It was created by the founding 4 organizations, so the international organizations for museums, monuments and sites, archives and libraries. And those are referred to as the founding 4. And the founding 4 still have reserved places on the Blue Shield board, but they also elect a president and 4 other members of the board alongside national committees, which are also envisaged under the Blue Shield movement. And now there are, as of today, 30 national committees globally, with another 10 under some level of preparation. And so they create, or they elect the board, and the board, together with a very small team, less than the equivalent of 2 full-time staff, are together called Blue Shield International. And it's that organization, it was those people who made the mistake of electing me as president. It's named obviously after the emblem of the 54 Convention. Our mission is there, and I'll read this quickly, but committed to the protection of the world's cultural property, echoing the 54 Convention, and is concerned with the protection of cultural and natural heritage, so trying to blur that distinction, tangible and intangible, because the 54 Convention only deals with tangible, so we're expanding that to intangible in the event of armed conflict, and also expanding it from the 54 Convention as a result of natural or human-made disaster. And the reason we do that is simple, because for the 3 sectors, the response to either a natural or human-made disaster overlaps significantly with the response to an armed conflict. Not entirely the same, but enough to put it all into the same package. And the image there you see is the Argentinian National Committee, who convinced Argentinian TV to do a six-episode, 30-minute each episode series on Argentinian TV about cultural property protection. The first, as far as I'm aware, anywhere in the world. So our primary context is the 54 Convention and the protocols, underpinned by some of that wider international context that I've mentioned already. We're also conscious, because of the disaster side, of things like the Sustainable Development Goals and things like the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. We see cultural property protection as a multi-sector responsibility and opportunity. And there you've just got one of, in fact now an ex-colleague, Paul Fox, working with colleagues from NATO on an exercise. Okay, stop working again there. Let's try this again. To do that, though, we have to work with partners, and we have to work with the uniformed sector, the humanitarian sector, and the heritage sector. I've said that already. And we have to understand the legal, political, and media context in which all of that works. And to do that, we're developing formal partnerships. We signed an MOU with the International Committee of the Red Cross in 2020. We have a formal understanding with NATO, with the UN peacekeeping force in Lebanon, and if only I could finish it, the documentation, we're ready to do one with UNESCO. And so long as you promise not to tell anybody, because it's not finally been signed yet, it will be in about 3 weeks, we're doing an MOU between the Smithsonian, Blue Shield International, and the Cultural Emergency Response organization in the Netherlands, which used to be part of Prince Claus. We envisage that as this. So the Blue Shield is a triangle, and as with all good triangles, it has 3 points. And those are the 3 sectors: humanitarian, heritage, and uniformed. And as put to me by an American officer sometime in the middle of last year, a colonel, excuse me, he said, "Oh, I get it, sir, looking at this. So the space in the triangle is where there are no stupid questions." And I said, exactly. So we all of those sectors start from completely different positions, but we all have a common interest and end aspiration, in Blue Shield language, the creation of those healthy, peaceful, stable, sustainable communities. And that's, oh, thank you. That's what goes on within the triangle. But we can't deliver that without the understanding of what goes in the outer circle and the political context of heritage, that it can be used and abused by politicians, the legal context, which we've talked a little bit about, and increasingly important, the media, and increasingly important, the social media context that we deal with. But then the reason we do it all, the communities down at the bottom. A key issue that we have to put across, which some people don't like, but Blue Shield International is an independent, impartial, and neutral organization. We will not and we do not criticize any party to a particular conflict. We encourage all parties to any conflict to abide by their rules, by their international regulations and their responsibilities under international human rights law, humanitarian law. But by acting in that way, we get to work with, hopefully, all parties to a situation or a conflict behind the scenes to bring them more closely together and to try and make sure that people abide by those things. And we hope to fulfill the original aspiration of those who drafted the 54 Convention of becoming that cultural equivalent of the Red Cross. National committees, on the other hand, by their very nature, work at a national level. And so they will, we hope, work with the National Ministry of Defence, National Armed Forces, National Ministry of Culture, etc. And so it becomes less easy for them to be overtly independent and impartial and neutral because of that national context. So there's the difference there, and you can see the difference already sort of forming as the difference between the ICRC, the independent, impartial, neutral organisation, part of the Red Cross movement, and the Red Cross societies, who are not infrequently less neutral and independent. We create something called the Blue Shield approach, which we've been developing since 2012, which essentially is why we do things and how we do them. And this isn't intended as a straitjacket, but as a context for national committees to work within. And we work with people both at a national and international level within these areas, which I'll rush through in a moment. But again, the mantra, we must start this work in peacetime, because if we don't do it in peacetime, it's too late if an armed conflict starts. So the approach includes 7 parts or phases. I'm not going to go through those on this slide because I'm going to gallop through them in a moment there, but you'll just get the idea of the sorts of things that we're talking about. So firstly, the 5 issues. And the reason we pulled these out is we want every national committee to respond to these 5 issues in a similar way. And so that's why these are pulled out, and they're critical, because they're, at one level, the 5 questions that all of us involved in this got bored with answering. And so these are the ones that are the most important. People are things, people first always, but that indivisibly intertwined, indivisible issue. Is it property? Is it heritage? Do I care? But the key thing is you use a standard language, and that essentially the cultural property of the 54 Convention means the same thing as cultural heritage in the 72 or other later conventions. Are we the cultural equivalent of the Red Cross? No, but that's absolutely our aspiration. Will we be in my lifetime? No. But if we don't start now, we won't be in my grandchildren's lifetime. So that's where we're coming from. Why is it important? I've talked about that already in the healthy, peaceful, secure, sustainable communities. And then that health warning that it can be used in a negative way as well as a positive way. So those are those key 5 issues. We also then have the 2000 Strasbourg Charter, which essentially set up the organisation as, in policy terms, the similar way to the ICRC. And again, I'm not going to go through all of those, but that's there. The mission we've already looked at, but that's the 3rd element of the approach. Then the 4-tier approach, which is astonishingly obvious and straightforward, but it changed the way certainly a number of armed forces think about the Blue Shield, because once they read this and thought about it, they said, oh, we now understand what you've been going on about for the last X number of months or years. So effective cultural property protection needs to take place at 4 times. Long term is that education that I talked about before, the packs of cards, all of that sort of stuff, of everybody in uniform. And bottom line, it means that everybody in uniform realizes that delivering good cultural property protection may, in the end result, save their life. And that's what focuses a military mind. Then secondly, either immediately before deployment, when they're going to country X, and they need to know what the cultural property is in that country, what's been done, who are the key people involved, etc. Then it's in conflict or in emergency, and what the military term reach back. So they can take a photograph of a cultural object and send it back in an email and ask, is this real or is this a fake? Has this come from this site, do you think, or whatever? And they can get an almost 24-hour response or less if we work properly with them in that area. And then critically, post-conflict and stabilization. And that's critical because the military are increasingly caught in the situation where they have to stay until there is a viable country to leave. And the viability of many countries is based on an economic balance, and part of that economic balance is tourism, and in many countries in the world, tourism is predicated around cultural tourism. So the cultural tourism element of economic stability in countries, especially in a lot of developing countries and Middle Eastern countries, is predicated around cultural tourism. So there's an issue there. And what we want to do through that is from day one of a recruit to some of the senior officers getting this training, that everybody understands the importance of cultural property protection to them as a military aspect of their deployment, not as a bolt-on add-on that the heritage sector asks for, but as something that will help them deliver their tasks. Fifth area is we have these 6 areas of what we call activity. And again, I'm not going to read them, you can see them on the screen. But we ask every national committee, and the Blue Shield International does this as well, to prioritize this list, not necessarily in the order on the screen, but as relevant to the national situation. And we ask them also to say in an annual plan what they're going to do. They don't have to address all 6 in their annual plan. They may only address 2 because those 2 are, large issues that that country particularly faces. And then we ask them to report on that at the end of that year and modify the plan and the prioritization of those areas of activity as their work develops and as they achieve more and more. And the rationale around that is that that gives a coherence to the whole organization, whether you're talking to the Argentinian or the American or the Australian National Committee. Everybody recognizes the 6 areas and they all recognize that that's what the National Committee is trying to achieve. We then have something called the 8 threats, and when I started working in this area in 2003, for most of my time, everybody told me, Pete, get real. It's cultural property. In a war, it's going to be blown up and damaged. There's nothing you can do about it. Well, actually, there are things you can do about it. If you identify what the threats are, you can mitigate those threats to stop them becoming real risks and to stop them damaging cultural property more than need be. And the first 2 of those relate to the second one that we've got on this list, military and humanitarian awareness, relates to the first phase of the 4-phase project, education. And it's just raising that awareness, and so that everybody in uniform, all deploying humanitarians, know about the importance of cultural property and its protection. Second one is, in terms of deployment to a particular place, the lack of planning for that. So in 2002, 2003, the planners for the coalition invasion of Iraq, there were 7 different elements to that planning system in Washington. One of them had a subcommittee on culture, which never met. So there was no planning for the cultural protection in the invasion of Iraq. As a consequence, all of the museums were looted, the libraries were looted, everything was looted, hundreds, if not thousands, of archaeological sites were looted, and all of that could have been mitigated to some extent had troops been given that training. The then director of research for the National Museum in Iraq went to the American Army on the, I can't remember, I think the 12th of April 2003, saying, please come to the National Museum, it is just about to be looted. And the US Army officers looked at their maps of Baghdad, and there were no cultural sites marked on their combat maps. So they thought that Donny was an insurgent leading them to a trap. And they almost apparently arrested him. And it was 3 days later that he went back to them and said, I wish you'd had come 3 days later, you could come now, but the museums have been looted. And there was a failure that these things weren't given the protection that they needed, but they weren't even marked on the maps so that some retrospective fit could have been done. If I just pause briefly here to give a good example and a bad example, or a less good example, let's say, of cultural property protection. In 1917, depending on your view, the British either occupied, liberated, conquered, or did something to Jerusalem. And in order to lower the risk of antagonism from the predominantly Muslim community in Jerusalem at that time, under the previously under the rule of the Ottoman Empire for the previous 700 years, the British force commander did two things. Firstly, he walked into Jerusalem to show that he wasn't coming as a crusader conqueror, but he was coming in peace. And the second thing he did was produce a proclamation which said that all of the holy shrines, sites of the three religions would be protected by his troops. And that was there to disarm any antagonism from the predominant community. And somebody on his staff was thinking at one stage more in detail, and this was the brilliant part of the step. So they didn't deploy British regular troops to protect the Islamic sites, because that would have been an affront. That would have been Christian troops protecting Islamic sites. They instead used what they had at their disposal, which were Indian Muslim troops from the Indian Army deployment, which was part of the expeditionary force. So in that one act, deploying Muslim troops to protect Islamic sites, the military disarmed any general population opposition to the military occupation. And there was no general public disorder or opposition to the military occupation. Wind that forward to 2006 in Iraq, and not only had none of the cultural sites been looked after, not only had the coalition disbanded the government and the Ba'ath Party, which removed the only market for the farmers. So all of the farming produce sat on the side of the road rotting, and the farmers therefore turned to the only other thing they could harvest from the field, looting antiquities. None of that was in place, but neither was the protection of religious sites. So the 2006 attack on the Al-Aqshari Mosque in Samarra, the third holiest place for Shia Muslims in the world, that was defined as most commentators, or by most commentators, as the tipping point between an Iraqi population increasingly fed up with the coalition still being there, into the full-scale sectarian civil war, which required the coalition to continue to stay for another 5 years, taking 5 years' worth of casualties, 5 years' worth of fatalities. And military thinkers understand that had they actually protected stuff, had they had orders to protect this stuff, they might not have lost all of those troops. But equally more, however you want to define it, there was a political ramification to that, which was the coalition and the West lost the media war in that context, and in particular, they lost the social media conflict. And that gave rise, that provided the oxygen for the re-establishment of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and it provided the oxygen for the creation of Daesh, or the so-called Islamic State. And I'm not saying that the destruction of the mosque in, the mosque in Samarra was the only reason for that, but it was a significant part of the jigsaw puzzle that led to that. And that leads to the present conflicts in the Middle East and that whole confusion. So there are key elements there. So just as examples of that. And then nearly finished, the 7 reasons why cultural property protection is important for uniformed and humanitarian sectors. And again, I've just picked out the key words in these. So it's a security issue from the UN point of view. It's the protection of people is indivisibly linked to the protection of their cultural property. It's the legal responsibility. It's the need to understand the political strategy that goes alongside that. Looting can become a major issue, as it did in Iraq, as it is in Syria, as it is in Yemen, as it is almost anywhere. And the reason this slide is on its own is because I picked it from a presentation where the Belgium National Committee were trying to convince the Belgian government not to close down the tiny Belgian police team who were trying to combat the trade in illicit cultural property. That wasn't successful. That unit was closed down. And then finally, the economic viability and the option of using it as soft power. And all of these things move to that mantra. So some of the things that we're doing at the moment, and I'll finish off with just a very few quick slides. We're raising awareness, not only with presentations like this, but lots of other stuff. We're building the capacity of national committees. We've just finished a series of training modules online for national committees before Christmas. There's another block of those coming in the next week or so. We're working closely with NATO on developing a template for cultural property protection information for especially NATO targeteers. We're developing exercise input with what they call problematic injects. So in other words, the Army is going to do A and B, the Air Force is going to do C, and we then put into the fact that actually if you do that, you're breaking international humanitarian law. And so that causes problems within NATO military thinking, and it begins to put into the mindset of senior officers that they have to take cultural property protection seriously. We'll talk about NATO policy in a moment. Working with other national and multinational military groups, we've trained the African Union troops who are deploying to Mali as an example, and the image there is my colleague Michael de la Cruz working with US Southcom, which has the responsibility for South America and the Caribbean, but working with 7 other armed forces across South America about cultural property protection in armed conflict in that region. We're developing material for peacekeepers. We're developing links to the humanitarian sector, and we're looking for long-term funding for a central office. So very quickly, how are we doing? Firstly, 2011 in the air campaign in Libya, the Blue Shield created lists of cultural property that we would prefer not to be damaged during the conflict, if at all possible. The targeteer for NATO was sitting at an airfield in the Netherlands, and he or she identified 6 vehicles of a mobile communication unit that were inside and close to a large derelict building. Those vehicles were deemed to be a legitimate target, and a weapon was chosen to destroy them, which was one large bomb, which would have blown up all 6 vehicles and the derelict building. I don't know the detail of what happened next, but the equivalent of a red light flashed on his or her computer, because the coordinates for the derelict building were the same coordinates for a fortified Roman farm that we'd asked not to be damaged if at all possible. The decision went up the food chain in the armed forces, and in military speak, they modified the ordnance, which means they changed the one big bomb to 6 precision weapons. Now, I don't know what they were or anything. The only bit that I know is that I have been told countless times by people in NATO who sort of regard us as a slight nuisance, that it increased the cost of that mission by more than a factor of 6. But it delivered something, it delivered 2 things. It destroyed all 6 of the vehicles, and if you can see clearly on the image, that tangled mess of metal is one of those vehicles, and the other 5 look exactly the same. But it also got something that NATO were incredibly unused to, which was good international publicity. And they got so much of the good international publicity that they actually decided to instigate an internal review about what they'd done right. And that review by the Naples Center reported in December 2012, and the claim was, or the first recommendation was that NATO should create a cultural property protection policy. We're not there yet, but we have got a directive in 2018, which is the first step to the policy, and we're working on the policy with NATO at the moment. So there's an element of success. In Syria in 2017, as the coalition forces tighten their grip and restricting the area controlled by Daesh, it ended up with essentially Daesh only controlling the territory of Raqqa, the town where they'd had their headquarters. Now, Raqqa has a medieval wall still all the way around the town, and the medieval wall is about 2.5 miles long. Daesh knew that the coalition were closing in on them and knew that they would be attacked soon. And so they put most of their forces at the gates through the medieval town, and the medieval wall. And the coalition forces knew that, and the gates were the last place they were going to go through. So they took a military decision, but informed by cultural property protection, that they destroyed 2 25-meter lengths of the medieval wall. As a result of that, they got into Raqqa with almost no casualties. They were able to get into Raqqa and deploy through Raqqa, and they took Raqqa with very, very limited casualties because of that. But they were very conscious that they were destroying 50 meters of the medieval wall. But their argument for doing that was reducing military casualties, delivering the military necessity for taking the town, and but preserving as much of the medieval wall as possible, much more of which may have been destroyed had they not targeted precise parts of it. So there's an element there that works. We've seen this quote earlier, but it was a quote that Eve did as we signed the MOU with the ICRC in 2020. And then almost finally, I just want to talk very quickly about Beirut. So we've been working with the UN peacekeeping force in Lebanon, the Lebanese Armed Forces, LAF, the Antiquities Department, the DGA, Blue Shield Lebanon, and an NGO in Lebanon called Biladi since 2013. And where we've been able to, we've trained those different groups together so that they begin to understand each other's problems and concerns and where they're starting off from. That built a partnership and a trust between those organizations. On the 4th of August in 2020, about 6 o'clock Lebanese time, there was the appalling explosion in the port. I was talking to colleagues in Lebanon about midnight on that Tuesday, and we worked out a plan that we agreed with the DGA the next morning, that the DGA would deal with all of the heritage that had a link to a government department, but that the DGA gratefully said to Blue Shield Lebanon and Biladi that they would be really pleased if they looked after the non-government related museums, archives, libraries, and some of the religious monuments. And so we did the colleagues in Lebanon, did a very quick photographic review of the damage done to all of those libraries and other buildings. And very simplistically, it was the same damage in all of them. They had no doors left, they had no windows left, and there had been some damage to tiles on the roof and other issues like that. So we did that photographic record. We then, over the next 3 days, I worked with a series of international heritage funders who were willing, if we could show them the evidence, to put funding into the securing of those buildings. And in other words, boarding up the windows, putting doors back on, and if there were a few tiles loose, putting the tiles back. Just keep that image in your mind, and I'll come back to it in a moment. But so we did that. The report we got on the Sunday, and by the Wednesday, we had a few pence short or cents short of 100,000 euros to secure all of those buildings. And we started using that money by the end of that week by buying boarding and new doors and the such. And we thought we'd nearly done our job. But then UNIFIL phoned up. And so this is the UN peacekeeping force, nothing to do with a heritage organization at all, but they'd learned over the previous 7 years the value of working with not only their Lebanese armed force colleagues, but also the heritage sector. And they said that the first thing was, they phoned up as soon as they got permission to come out of their area of responsibility and come to Beirut. And they said there must be cultural heritage that's been damaged. And so the first thing that we did, and just to go back to that image, lots of sites, lots of roads look like this. But what was happening was that the municipality were just clearing up the roads and shoveling all of the debris into lorries, which were being taken away and thrown into the sea or into landfill. And what we did with one particular historic area with LAF and UNIFIL was try to identify some of the the debris on the street with the building that had come off, so that that might then be put back into the right building, and we might maintain some of the cohesion of those buildings. But then in particular, we looked at 2 buildings that required a massive amount of immediate intervention, otherwise the buildings wouldn't be there for very long. One of these was the one that you see here, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And you can see that 3 sides, the bits of white, are where the roof was essentially destroyed completely, or the tiles on the roof completely destroyed. Where there still are tiles, there had been missing tiles, but the tiles were put back. And that, of course, is the back of the building from where the blast came directly opposite. So that was the bit of the roof which was protected. The problem with having 3/4 of your roof blown off if you're a building of this nature is that it is the weight of the roof that keeps the building together. And if you lose 3/4 of the weight of the roof, all sorts of things that you wish didn't happen to the rest of the building started happening. So the walls of the building were going out like this at a rate of 20 centimetres a week. And that wasn't going to last very long before the whole building collapsed. And so under the sort of control of some Blue Shield and Beladi architects, LAF and UNIFIL, with their heavy lifting equipment, with their personnel, with their structural engineers, were able to pull the walls in and then put a temporary roof on the building. And as a result, that building will last for a number of years without any intervention. And the temporary roof is supposed to be there for 5 years. I bet you it's there in 10 years' time. But it gives the municipality, the country, the government, whoever, the time to find the money to do the proper stabilization of the building and put a proper roof back on and whatever. And the other building we did was in a similar sort of situation. But none of that would have happened had we not had 7 years of partnership and collaboration between those different entities. UNIFIL would never have phoned us up. The Lebanese Armed Forces would never have agreed to work with either UNIFIL or us on that project. And that just simply would not have happened. So it's that, again, you have to do things in peacetime. This is just a very quick thing which we won't go through in any detail at all. But this is an excerpt from a military document written by Lieutenant Colonel Tim Purbrick, who was the first commanding officer of the UK's Cultural Property Protection Unit. And this is a justification as to why the UK should establish such a unit. So the first thing, which was a few pages, was the legal responsibility. But then Tim went into the opportunity to support mission success. And there you can read almost everything about soft power that you can think of for a military deployment. And that list was why the Cultural Property Protection Unit essentially got funded. There was the legal responsibility as well, but that was there. And the sort of icing on the cake was Tim's argument that if we don't do this, then it can lead to the alienation of the local population and undermining the force credibility. And you'll be pleased to know, the last slide, there is an extraordinary long way to go. As I've said, it ain't going to happen in my lifetime. But as I've also said, if we don't start now, it's never going to happen. I hope it happens in the lifetime of these volunteers from Lebanon who were all students who volunteered to work with us in that work. And thank you over to you. I'm afraid I've gone on for too long, but such is life.
Thank you, Professor. I suppose that it was not too long, for sure. Now we will have a presentation of colleagues from Poland. Therefore, I need, there is no connection. We can't switch on or switch out when... Jo, man reikėtų, kad jūs išjungtumėt kompiuterį, nes reikės, kad jisai pats galėtų rodyti. Okay, so we still not have colleagues from Poland. So it's probably a few minutes if you have any questions from here in Ministry of Culture here presents physically.
Thank you for a very interesting and useful presentation. I'm Ramojus Kraujelis, representing Kernavė Ecological Site, one of the places that is included in the enhanced list. Only one in Lithuania and probably only one in Baltic states as well. And what we just did during the last month, there was a small correction on the order of Ministry of Culture, and now we officially use the blue shield sign with this red border line. Yep. We have the sign at the entrance of our site on the main road. But what we discovered that the second protocol is not signed by Russia, and for sure we now, on the eve of the war between Ukraine and Russia, we feel the most threat from that side. Yep. And actually we thought about writing the sign, now it's written in Lithuanian and in English information. Yep. We thought about writing in Russian as well, but yep. How could you comment the situation that one country is not signing the second protocol? So how to treat this situation?
Yeah, that's a very opportune and real problem. And technically, it makes it more difficult to blame, in this instance, the Russian Federation if they were to damage a site because they haven't ratified the second protocol. However, there is a legal argument that says the second protocol is part of what is referred to as international customary law. And as international customary law, so in other words, there are enough people in the world who have ratified it to make it applicable to everybody. Now, it would be much nicer if there were more than 85 countries that have ratified the second protocol, but 85 is not a bad list. And also 85 is a list, are 85 countries that nobody involved in attacking cultural property in a conflict could go to if they wanted to feel safe from being arrested and prosecuted in one of those 85 countries for war crimes. So it can give a deterrent. It is not nearly as strong a deterrent had all parties to the conflict ratified the second protocol, but it's a step in the right direction. And we're constantly asked, why should we ratify all of these things? Why should we obey the rules when the people we're fighting don't? And the answer to that is that just because they and whoever they are acting in a way that is inconsistent with international law doesn't mean that we have to sink to their depth. So we should be trying to, by example, encourage everybody to work at that level. And as an aside, lots of people say that lots of these non-state, so-called armed non-state actors, they all want to damage cultural property. There's an organization in Geneva called Geneva Call, and they wrote a report having worked with, I think, 20, if not more, armed non-state actors around the world, and the majority of whom actually want to protect cultural property because they're fighting, in their view, to protect the land in which they live, which includes the cultural property. They just don't know how to, and nobody will work with them because they are an armed non-state actor. So yes, there are the extreme versions of Daesh or Al-Qaeda or Ansandine who will purposefully attack, but the number of those groups who will purposefully attack are much more limited than we think. But yeah.
Oh, okay. Is it an answer to your question as well? Yeah. Because I have another part that I have mentioned of this during the lunchtime of this question, when there is very skeptical views about marking of objects of the culture heritage with the blue shield, taking supposing that, as a colleague has mentioned, that the other part will not follow, yes, so...
Yeah,
so I just, the other part of this question is, what would you say to those people who are, how to say, very skeptical and thinking that it is marking like a target for the aggressor?
There are two parts to the answer to that. In every conflict that I've had any knowledge of or any understanding of, the people who actually specifically target cultural property know exactly what they want to target, and they are going to target it whether there is a blue shield on it or not. It doesn't act as a target list. It is frequently a lesser part of a list than the list that that group have put together. So just as one example of that, I was working in the former Yugoslavia, and I was talking to the Minister of Culture of Croatia. And when the Croatian government was still the regional government as the Yugoslavia was breaking up, he told me the story that there had been a discussion amongst the nearly national government as to whether or not they should give to UNESCO the list of cultural sites. And he said no, but he was outvoted, and so the list went to UNESCO. Every one of those sites on the list was targeted, but they then found from the Serbian side, there were earlier documents found that had all of the sites that were targeted that the Croatians had given to UNESCO, but also more. And so the enemies of Croatia had a longer list of sites that they were going to target than those sites that the Croatians thought they wanted to protect. So people in a conflict who are keen to destroy cultural property know exactly what they want to destroy, and putting a blue shield on it is giving them no help whatsoever. The reason for putting the blue shield on it is that it gives the protection under the 54 Convention, and also under other, it gives the prosecution better evidence for the fact that these places were known as cultural property and important cultural property, and therefore if they were specifically targeted, then that act can be seen as a war crime. But if they're not identified on a list, it becomes more difficult to identify them as a war crime, because it could just be a site that, if it's not on the list, then it's not important. So there are two sides to that. Anybody who wants to destroy cultural property knows exactly what they want to destroy, and if you don't put the blue shield emblems there, then you can't actually use that as evidence for specific targeting. And very quickly, one of the issues in Ukraine was that the Ukrainian government, in their response to the periodic reporting system for the 54 Convention, had in 2017 said in their report that they weren't going to use the blue shield. They were going to use, I think the term was, a nationally recognized emblem. And so as soon as the conflict started, I wrote to the Minister of Culture asking them specifically to use the blue shield for the very purpose of making it clear that it was a site protected by Ukraine underneath the convention, and therefore, if it has been specifically targeted, it could be a war crime. If it wasn't clearly identified, it would be much more difficult to use as evidence for a war crime. And UNESCO wrote a few days later with the same request, and the following week, Ukraine started putting some of the biggest blue shields I've ever seen on some of the monuments and museums. So it's there, and it really, I understand the concern, but I really do not believe, I have never seen an example of how that marking has led to targeting. It's people who target know what they're going to target without the blue shield. Okay, is this on? Yes. What are the key things at a national, institutional and personal level? So to turn them around the other way, national first is, as you showed very well, and as Polish colleagues have shown, that at a national level you need the policies in place and you need those policies to be implemented. And that takes you down to the institutional level, because it's the institutions who are going to actually implement the national policies. So if the policy is there, but nobody implements it, then it's not a very useful policy. And so you have to have not only the National Museum or the National Library, but you have to have all libraries or all museums, or the key ones at least, to implement those policies. And then, so you then get down to the personal level, and a key part, as Christoph has just said, of delivering a policy as an action is identifying people who are responsible. And so you have to look at the personal responsibility of members of staff. So one of the key things that we've been discussing over the last few weeks is, who are the key people in an institution? And very firmly, the person who's writing the cyber information for us says you have to have somebody in the institution who takes responsibility for cyber protection, and that person has to have the skills to understand what experts are talking about. And if you haven't appointed somebody like that, then that post is the most important post to appoint in your institution, because there's no point in having that at a national level. You need that at the institutional level, because you need the understanding of the institutional context.
Thank you. So waiting for another questions, probably here I have another one. Sorry. You have mentioned that you organize the trainings and workshops, but only for national committees and for those countries who have national Blue Shield committees, or anybody can join? No, anybody could come to those workshops and the training that we do. And especially, one of the minor reasons for coming on this trip is, of course, to encourage all three countries to create a national committee of the Blue Shield. And by creating national committees, you become part of that network, and you can pick good ideas from other national committees.
We have monthly meetings online of national committees where they either do little presentations about what National Committee A is doing and whatever, or they just sit and talk and they, you know, we've got a problem about this. Has anybody else got that problem? And if they have, how do they deal with it? And so it's that network of people dealing with similar issues and similar problems that is one of the massive benefits of having a national committee.
Okay, and whenever my question, sorry, really, I took off the time, but we know all such things like red lists, emergency red lists. They actually are made by ICOM, and now, after visits of all Baltic countries now, would you suggest for us, for Lithuania, or maybe in cooperation of free countries, to have such a list, not even before the X day come, just because everybody understands red lists, you know, the list of values, cultural values from the places where the war is, was, and it's about something exotic like India, Syria, Libya, and others countries, but nobody thinks about emergency red lists when it is a peacetime. So do you think, and would you recommend for Baltic states to start this for preparing?
I would certainly recommend that you have the conversation with ICOM as to whether they would be open to, you know, creating a red list for you. There's another issue that is sort of broader than this, and we were talking about this at the Blue Shield board last week, I think. Yes, it must have been last week because I've been here all this week. And that's the difference between a red list and a list of cultural property at risk. So the red lists are the sort of generic type of objects that may be at risk and that may be stolen and that may be seen at customs and borders. Okay, but what is would be really useful to have is a list of cultural property at risk. Now, there is a private institution in the UK, the Art Loss Register, which some of those of you in the museums world will have heard of. But the Art Loss Register's main lists, as with Interpol's list and Europol's list and everybody else's lists, are lists of objects that have already been stolen. And so they are there saying, this has been stolen. If you find it, if you see it, if somebody tries to sell it to you, beware and do that. What the Art Loss Register is setting up, and this is developing, but is this at risk list, which is saying, here is the entire contents of the National Museum. There is a conflict going on. It is likely that the museum is going to be looted, or maybe that part of it is looted. And here are all the things that might come up as for sale. And they may not have the provenance of being stolen. They may not be known to have been stolen. So the idea of this new database is everything that's at risk in a country could be on it, because then that's the really useful list for somebody who wants to buy something or somebody who wants to sell something. It's relatively easy to say that something is known to have been stolen, but where's this come from? How do we know where it's come from or why? And if you've got a list that you can check it against, then that's going to be a massive help. It's also a massive undertaking. So let's start with the ICOM red list of the type of stuff that you might see and take one small step at a time.
Thank you. So I have to speak with a microphone, and I'm trying to check if there is any questions in chat, but I can't see. So I suppose that there is no questions. So everything is very clear and inspiring, and I suppose that everybody will have something to think about after this meeting. Actually, we have to end of the meeting, and I would once again like to thank you very much for visiting us, for sharing your experience with us and ideas and practical issues. And we will think over about the National Committee because we know that Poland has, and as far as I remember, probably Estonians are planning.
The Estonians are thinking about it.
Oh, thinking. So we will start thinking too.
And then if you both think about it, so will the Latvians.
Yeah, and then the Latvians will join us about thinking about the National Committee.
Absolutely.
So it was a pleasure to welcome you here. And it was a pleasure, I suppose, for those who were watching us, despite all the technical and voice or something, it is quite new for us. Sorry. Also, as for many people, suppose, thank you for coming here. Thank you for being with us, joining us, sharing your time, and hope that, as you mentioned, when the military said to you, okay, we will be in touch, but it meant that I don't want to see you anymore. But I will say for all the participants and here in the hall and online, we will be in touch. But it doesn't mean that we don't want to see you anymore. So thank you, and I wish a good evening. And if you want to,
could I just say one more thing? In terms of being in touch, we will. I've given colleagues here PDFs of the PowerPoint presentation, so we hope those will be circulated to everybody. What I am most interested in is any feedback on, I think it's the last 3 slides of the first presentation, those topic sheets that we are talking about. And what I want to know is, are those the right topics? And when we actually get the topic sheets finished, we will send them out. And are they at the right level of detail? And do you need more information or do you need less information? Because we want those to be as valuable as possible. And as ever, with the people who create something, will think it's perfect. But the people who need to use it may have very different ideas. So please, really a heartfelt wish. These 3 countries have got the opportunity of really influencing those sheets. We'll send them to you in draft as soon as they're ready in the next few weeks. And please then do feedback what will be a very tight turnaround, because we want those to be ready for other countries to think about now in terms, these are the questions that you need to think about in peacetime. Hopefully there is going to be many years of peace, but just in case there aren't, we need those questions thought about sooner rather than later. So please, it's a real request, do comment and criticize to your heart's content. I have a very thick skin.
And it means that we will be in touch.
Absolutely.
So thank you. It was a pleasure to welcome you here, and till next time. Okay.